You know what this is. It's a Ferrari. It's the most iconic emblem of any car on the planet. This car stops traffic. People break their necks trying to see this car and who it is driving. This is a car that every 12-year-old boy dreams of growing up driving. For me, it all started with Magnum PI's Ferrari 308. Between that sweet car and Tom Selleck's killer mustache, he was by far the coolest guy of the 1980s. I wanted to be Magnum. All I needed was the Detroit Tigers hat, a mustache, and of course a Ferrari. I had none of that, but those are just minor details. This is the 2014 Ferrari 458 Spider, and it comes courtesy of our good friend Todd Beckstrom at ERA Wilder Realty. This model is an Argento Nürburgring metallic paint with Sevilla leather interior. Comes with an 11-speaker JBL system pumping out 1,000 watts of sweet harmony. This model has a 4.5-liter V8 engine connected to a 7-speed dual-clutch, high-performance automatic transmission. This engine can put out an incredible 562 horsepower at 9,000 RPMs. So how much does it cost? Well, it falls in that category if you have to ask. But since you are asking, you need somewhere between $245,000 and $270,000. That's a lot of GCI. I am Gary Pickren, and this is our new show, Brokers and Cars Talking Contracts. Each week we ride around in Columbia with some really cool cars and some somewhat cool real estate brokers talking about the contract. Today our guest is my good friend Dianne Bunnell. She's also from ERA Wilder Realty on Devine Street. Dianne and I have been friends now for about 3 or 4 years. Dianne is from Florida, where Ferraris are as common as the Ford F-150 is in South Carolina.
Uber?
Did you call it Uber?
I did.
Is this what you're looking for?
Well, if I can get in. Not exactly. I actually requested a Bentley.
Well, this is all they had on the lot left, so you'll have to suffer through the Ferrari, which will
all
scare the
right.
crap out of you, by the way. Hey, I appreciate you, Dianne, coming back and doing this with us again.
Sure.
As you remember, we did this, what was it, September last year? And
Gosh, it's been a while.
Yeah, I think I remember going like 91 miles an hour the first time.
Yeah.
That was really cool.
Yeah.
But,
No, I actually think we got close to 100.
100, okay. Well, the good thing was that it didn't work because the video didn't work, so I get to do it again.
And I get to ride again.
I think Todd, Beckstrom, who owns this car, thinks that I really made that up and that the video's done and that I just want to drive his car again, which, why not? It's a pretty awesome car. But
Absolutely.
Anyway, but thank you for coming back. And
Glad to do it.
I mean, painful duty of having to redo a video in a Ferrari.
I know.
But we were talking last time, and you had some really cool questions about the real estate contract, so let's shoot and do it again.
Well, one of the things I have been seeing, and I wonder what you're seeing, if it makes it all the way to you this way, is just incredibly ridiculous or inadequate property descriptions.
Absolutely. That's funny because I remember last time we talked about a closing we had or a closing situation we had where the agent wrote a contract using just the address, no tax map number, no lot number, anything. And what happened was the owner actually owned the house on one lot and then the adjacent lot next door. The intent was to convey both lots and the house, but because the attorney who did the closing I think it was out of Sumter or wherever, did the closing, he did it based on the contract and the address, so they transferred the house and not the vacant lot. So of course the vacant lot goes into a tax sale, gets sold to somebody else who then calls the homeowner, says, you want your lot back, you need to pay me a lot of money.
Gosh.
They filed a grievance against the real estate agent, which is how I got involved representing the agent, and we had an issue there because the agent didn't do their due diligence. So whenever you do a contract, I think it's very important that the agent doesn't get lazy and just use the address or just a tax map number. They really need to do a little investigation at least to find out and what the address is, what the lot number is, what the tax map number is. And most of our counties have phenomenal resources, richlandonline.com, lex-co.com. You can pull the tax records. You can find enough information to find out the lot, the block, the neighborhood, the tax map. I think, as I mentioned to you as well, also, lawyers don't care about addresses. When we do a deed, it's based on a lot, it's based on a block, it's based on a tax map, and address aren't used at all. It's really just used for 911 and for mailing purposes. So when at CCRA, when we did that section of the contract, the big thing was making sure that all the agents fill that out. So if I was an agent and I got a contract that said Azalea Street in Columbia, and that's all it says, I'd send it back and say, what are you trying to buy, the whole street, or you want to buy our lot? Or the listing agent could also fill that information out themselves and send it back almost as if you were doing a counter.
So does the TMS number work?
TMS number is good. It shouldn't be the sole thing they use.
Okay.
But a lot of times when you have acreage, that's all you'll have. It's
Right.
just the acreage. You won't have an address, but you can fill things out like on U.S. Highway 378 in Lexington, this tax map number. But one thing is interesting, and I'm glad you brought that point up, is if somebody's buying acreage, it's always a good idea maybe to attach the plat. See attached plat, particularly if it's 30 acres and they're buying 10 acres. And where you have a lot of problems is people will literally, with a pen, draw a line and say they're buying these 10 acres. Well, we know that's not accurate. So if they're going to do that, they really need to get with a lawyer to make sure that of the 30 acres, we're properly identifying the 10 acres. Otherwise, you might not have a contract.
Right.
So yeah, it's a mess, and hopefully good agents do it the right way. New agents sometimes don't understand the importance of that, so it's incumbent upon a good broker like yourself working with the agents, which is why we need good brokers.
I agree.
There you go.
More good brokers. Well, another thing that I've seen is a lot of contracts where negotiations have gone back and forth, and a lot of things are crossed out, and you can't tell where the initials are and where they aren't. What's the best practice on that?
Yeah, in some cases, it's just best to resubmit the contract as a clean contract. So if you've had offers, counter offers, and counter offers, and counter offers, and you can't read it anymore, have the next person making the counter offer redo the contract and submit it on a clean contract. And that's where having these zip forms and things like that people can go in and type the numbers out. But a funny story we had happen was it had gone back and forth so many times and the writing was so illegible, no one really knew what the number was. And so the lender, the agent, and the attorneys all thought it was a different number. And so when we got to closing, the loan package was based on like 114, and we all thought it was 119. And so the lender's like, well, we've based it on 114, and I'm not sure there's enough value in the property at 119. We're going to have to send the appraiser out. We're going to go back and redo underwriting. So as they got to closing, got the closing package, as we do sometimes right at the closing, found a big problem because somebody's handwriting between a 4 and 9, no one knew what it was.
Yeah.
So it's very important that they get that cleaned up and make sure they submit a clean contract.
That's what I usually tell an agent to do is,
Yeah.
Let's start from the beginning.
That's right.
New numbers.
Yeah, just start all over.
So that everybody agrees on.
Yeah, clean it out, make it everything right.
Exactly.
That's exactly right.
Exactly. I know you're kind enough to come to our sales meetings and share things with my agents, and we talked a lot at the end of the year. We always talk a lot about tax prorations. Yep. Tell me a little bit about how you guys handle that.
All right, so tax prorations has been a big mess since South Carolina went to the 2-tier tax system. You got 4% for owner occupied, 6% if somebody's using the property as a rental, an investment, or a second home. And so what happens is sometimes you'll have a seller who is selling the house, they're being taxed at 6%, the buyer is going to be buying at 4%. So we get into a debate. Do we prorate the taxes based on the actual tax bill from last year, which is a bigger credit for the buyer, or do we prorate on what the tax bill will be? Because we've seen situations where, especially in November or December, you're doing a closing, the seller is giving a tax proration $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, but when the buyer moves in, their whole tax bill is $2,000. And so people get upset about that. I would tell you, the seller's not being taken advantage of. They're already supposed to pay the 6% taxes. So it's just because a buyer is buying the property at 4% doesn't mean the seller's getting screwed. They just, it is what it is. The buyer's just getting a benefit, but it's not on the back of the seller. So what we did at CCRA with our contract is originally the contract said it was based on best information provided to the closing attorney. And it was the closing attorney's decision to make that. Well, it wasn't uniform. Most closing attorneys like our firm were using last year's tax bill because truly that is the best information available. There's no other information out there.
Right.
Some lawyers were using the tax estimator that the county has. Well, the tax estimator itself says this is not deemed reliable and should not be used for any other purposes. So if it's telling you it's not reliable, why would a closing attorney use it? Because it's not reliable. Yeah. So we cleaned it up and we changed it where it simply says you will use last year's tax bill unless the parties agree otherwise. So if parties have a problem with it because they represent a seller who doesn't want it prorated that way, they can negotiate it and do it at the 4% if that's what they want. But the time to negotiate that is at negotiation and not the closing table. Because the mess it creates at the closing table. Now all of a sudden it's going back to underwriting.
I've been there and done that.
Exactly. It's got to go back to underwriting. And what some buyers don't understand is that $5,000 tax credit now becomes a $1,000 tax credit, which means now they bring $4,000 more to closing, which they don't have, can't prove they have, and now the lender's like, well, we can't close.
Right.
So it's a mess. But if that's something that somebody wants to do, that's fine. They just need to come to that agreement at contract negotiations. But yeah, the whole thing's a mess. I would offer this as well. A lot of the associations say, hey, we need to fix it, we need to change it. But keep in mind, it did lower property taxes for primary residence holders when we went to the two systems. So everybody who had houses as primary residents, the taxes went down on those properties. So if we go back to the one-tier system, you and I know how the government works. They're not going to go back to a 4% for everybody. They'll just go to 6% for everybody.
Right.
So it's not going to help anything.
Right. So if I've got an agent who writes a contract in October and they're going to close mid to late November, what is the best thing for them to tell their client on the buyer side?
On the buyer side is to go ahead and tell their client that based on the contract as it's written now, the seller is going to have to give you prorations based on last year's tax bill. So you're going to get a nice tax credit. You'll need to go down there and change it to 4%. But the contract's the contract. It says you don't have to reprorate. In fact, the contract says all prorations are final as of closing. So there is no obligation, there's no duty to go back. And that's a great question, because what a lot of people do, a lot of attorneys do, is they'll slip a form at the closing that says parties agree to reprorate after closing. There's no reproration after closing. Contract controls that, and a good agent representing a seller or a buyer should not let that form be signed. There's one law firm in town, I don't know if they still do it, that used to say they would take the tax bill times 1.05% and prorate based on that. That's not in the contract, so I don't know why the parties would ever agree to something that's not in the contract.
So the contract's always going to prevail.
Contract prevails. So if they want to do it any different way, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to fly real quick. How about that?
The fun part.
That was 63 miles an hour at about 100 feet. Sorry for that. That was
No.
fun. But yes, the contract prevails.
It's a good thing I'm not behind the wheel.
Yes. Last time we did this, a lady, I was so scared we were driving. If you remember, I was driving like 50 miles an hour on the interstate, and a little lady came by and gave me a thumbs up in a minivan. So that's when I got it. So this time I will not be embarrassed this time.
There you go.
I just don't want to get a ticket. So plus it's hard to see out this car. So here we go again.
All right.
Anyway, there we go. That was 79 miles an hour at 200 feet.
There you go.
So anyway, all right. So that's the answer to that question.
Okay, cool. Well, I spent a lot of years in Florida before I moved back to Columbia.
That's right.
And so we dealt with homeowners associations all the time, and it was real clear and it was real simple, and we always went back and got the financial records and budgets and minutes and all of this kind of stuff. But here in Columbia, we don't see that as much.
That's right.
So how do we work the whole prorations, and what information should a buyer get?
Yeah, so with HOAs, it is a problem. In South Carolina, a lot of HOAs are actually run by individuals who live in the neighborhood. They don't have management companies like MJS and places like that. And so what happens is you can't find the person, or you find the person and they're on vacation, or they work 45, 50 hours a week and can't get them on the phone. So it's hard to get that information a lot of the time. So you're kind of at the mercy. So what the lawyer's job to do is to get what's called the estoppel letter. The estoppel letter is the HOA gives us a letter telling us what the amounts were to prorate off of, how much money's due, what the annual dues are, and when they're going to be done, and then the lawyer will prorate that. The big problem you get into is when assessments have been levied. An assessment is a special assessment, not your annual dues. It's that our swimming pool needs to be resurfaced, or the basketball courts need new goals, and so they levy an annual a one-time assessment that's either collected once or over a couple of years. Well, the key to that under the contract is, when is the assessment levied? As soon as that special assessment is levied, that's the person's responsible. Unfortunately, that could be the buyer, it could be the seller. And we have seen it at closing both ways, where literally the week of closing, the HOA comes out and issues a $1,000 assessment against all houses for resurfacing of a private road or whatnot. So if it's before closing, seller's paying it. If it came up after closing, which we've seen as well, where 2 months after closing, a buyer gets a letter, hey, there's a $3,000 assessment on these condo units for repainting and roofing, unfortunately the buyer has to pay it. So it's all based on that date of when that special assessment's on. Now, the law firm should be providing you also a copy of the restrictions. If you're ever in a situation where you're doing a closing and you're concerned before writing the contract, that's the time to look at the restrictions.
Yeah.
Because
so that can't be done during the due diligence. That's not.
Well, you could do it during the due diligence.
Okay.
we think it's always a good idea to start looking and doing that beforehand. But remember, your due diligence is only 10 days under the CCRA, 10 business days under the CCRA contract. And so that is part of due diligence, but it's good to always try to get a good handle and an early jump on that. So, for instance, if you were representing a client that was buying in Kenwood or Wildwood or Wood Creek, you could always call our firm and say, hey, I got a buyer buying in Kenwood and they're wanting to add a swimming pool. I'm not sure if they can do that. Do you have a copy of the restrictions? We can get you a copy and email them over to you so that you can take a look at it.
Okay.
Our firm has actually started by county, saving them in a special file by county, by neighborhood, so that if we ever need that, we can just pull it pretty quickly.
You know, the special assessment brings up a question that came to mind for me, is that number one, I think in most instances, most HOAs are required to give notice of special assessments, and a lot of special assessments require like a 2/3 vote on part of the members. But what if you have a situation where, how does that come into play with disclosures? If a seller has gotten a notice that there's going to be a special assessment and it doesn't show up somewhere and they don't disclose it, what's the effect of that?
It goes back to when it was levied. Now, disclosure, if they have notice of it, they've got to disclose it. But under disclosure, you can only disclose what you know.
Right.
Remember, under our statute is do you know or have actual knowledge of. It's not know or should have known. So things happen in your HOA you have no knowledge of. You know, the board could have met, the delegates could have met, have agreed to pass it. Some people in the neighborhood may know about it. You may not know about it. But it's the date that it's assessed is the date that matters. And as far as disclosure, you can only disclose it if you know it, but even though you didn't disclose it, if it was assessed before closing, then you would ultimately be responsible as the seller to pay that.
Got it.
So, cool.
Good stuff.
All right. Well, this has been fun driving around. I think Todd's waving at us to please pull over because he doesn't want to drive it anymore. So I'm only at 62 miles an hour, so I'm going to go to like 100 real quick if I can get out of this traffic, and then I'm going to, guess we go back to your office.
Perfect.
Cool beans.
But we gotta hit 100 first.
Yeah, let's try it right here. There you go. Wow, that was pretty fast. That's like 95 miles an hour. Good God, this scares the crap out of me.
Now we'll test the braking power.
I can't afford to pay for this car. I have 2 children. I can't afford to pay for this if I wreck it. So,
I imagine this is several college graduations.
This is a car for people with no children, because if you have children, this is your car.
Right.
I mean, first of all, there's nowhere to put your 2 children in this car, but
exactly.
You also can't afford this car with kids. So, cool. All right, well, it was a lot of fun, and
good.
We'll see you soon.
All right, sounds good, Gary.